Welcome back, everyone. This is Trevor. I've watched a lot of supposed Bigfoot evidence over the years, and honestly, most of it feels impossible to take seriously. But the footage you're about to see stands out from the rest. Join me as we dive into the most clear Bigfoot footage on camera. Thomas Bannister had spent 20 years pointing cameras at animals in the Pacific Northwest forests. He had filmed bear behavior in the Cascades, followed wolf-pack dynamics across 3 winters in Idaho, and spent 3 consecutive winters embedded with a Roosevelt elk herd in the Olympic Peninsula. He understood large animal behavior the way someone understands anything they have spent 2 decades watching closely. Not from textbooks, but from the accumulated weight of having seen what was normal so many times that the first moment something was not normal registered before he could have explained why. He knew what hunting looked like. He knew what instinct looked like. What he watched on his editing screen on November 8, 2016, was neither of those things. It was something he did not have a word for yet. And the word he eventually settled on, after a year of working through what the footage meant, was the reason he made a decision at the end of that year that most people in his field thought was wrong. He withheld evidence, deliberately. He had a second clip, captured almost a year after the first, and he chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, but because of what a year of studying the first clip had taught him about what was living in that forest. And the reasoning behind that decision is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. Thomas had arrived at the Hoh River area of Olympic National Park in late October 2016, following Roosevelt elk through the early stages of their winter migration. The Hoh rainforest was old-growth Pacific Northwest at its most dense, Douglas fir and Sitka spruce with canopies so thick that midday light barely touched the ground. The river flats pulled elk down from the ridges, and the game trails were ancient, worn so deep into the soil by generations of the same animals using the same routes for so many years that the paths looked more like trenches than trails. Thomas had been in this area before. He knew the river crossings. He knew the game trails. He knew exactly which crossing to put a camera on to get footage worth driving all the way from Seattle for. He bolted a high-resolution motion-activated unit 12 feet up a Douglas fir on November 1st, angled toward a shallow crossing point where fresh elk tracks showed the animals had been coming through regularly. The camera could record in clear detail even in near darkness, and its trigger was fast enough to catch almost any animal that moved through the frame. Thomas checked the angle, made sure the battery was full, and drove back to his camp near the park entrance. He planned to come back in 5 days, pull the memory card, see what he had, and reposition the camera if he needed to. He pulled the card on November 8th. He was expecting elk footage. The clip from 6:44 a.m. on November 3rd opened on a normal dawn scene. Soft gray light coming through the trees, the river moving slow and dark, a section of muddy bank where the water got shallow enough to cross without much trouble. The motion trigger had caught a young black-tailed deer stepping into the shot from the left side of the frame, picking its way carefully down the bank toward the water with the nervous start and stop walk of an animal that was paying attention to its surroundings but had not picked up on anything specific to be scared of yet. The deer looked like it weighed around 90 pounds, young, still a little unsure of itself, ears swiveling to catch any sound, nose testing the cool morning air. It reached the edge of the water and put its head down to drink. The camera was still running when the big cedar tree on the right side of the frame suddenly had something behind it that had not been there a moment before. Bigfoot stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive old-growth cedar about 40 feet from the deer and placed itself with a kind of slow, deliberate purpose that was completely unlike anything Thomas had seen in 20 years of wildlife filming. It did not wander in. It did not step through. It placed itself. One moment the cedar was just a cedar. The next moment something was using it as a hide, and the way it tucked in behind the trunk, the exact angle it picked to stay out of the deer's sightline, the instant total stillness it dropped into the moment it was in position. All of it communicated one thing without any ambiguity at all. This was a plan, already in progress before the camera caught it. Bigfoot was at least 8 feet tall. Its hair was dark brown with lighter coloring across the face and chest, and the individual hairs were clearly visible in the morning light, moving slightly in the river breeze the way real hair moves, the way actual individual strands shift at different speeds when the wind catches them, darker along the spine and thicker on the arms where the coat was more matted. Its shoulders were wider than anything Thomas had ever pointed a camera at. Its arms, visible where they gripped the bark of the cedar, hung past its knees. Its hands, spread out flat against the tree trunk, covered what Thomas would later estimate at nearly 3 feet of bark, and then nothing moved, not once. The deer kept drinking, head down, completely unaware. Bigfoot had not made a sound. The position it had chosen put it in the cedar shadow and broke up its outline enough that from the deer's direction it was almost invisible. And that was not an accident. To choose that specific position required knowing in advance where the deer would be looking. The deer had been completely outthought. 17 seconds passed. The camera recorded every one of them. During those 17 seconds, Bigfoot didn't move a single time. No weight shifts, no muscle twitches, none of the small involuntary movements that every large animal makes simply from being alive. Its head stayed locked on the deer, tracking without a single adjustment. Whatever was happening in Bigfoot's mind, the body was under a level of voluntary control that had no equivalent in any predator Thomas had ever studied. He would later say the stillness was the most disturbing part of the whole clip, not what came after it, but what it implied about what was going on before. Then it launched? That was the word Thomas used every single time he described what came next. Not ran, not charged, launched. From total stillness to full speed in what looked like a single movement. No building, no transition, no middle stage. One moment completely still behind the cedar. The next moment covering ground at a speed the camera's microphone recorded as heavy thumping impacts, each one barely a fraction of a second apart. Each one hitting like something very large and very fast was making contact with the earth. 40 feet in under 3 seconds. The deer's head came up at the second footfall. Its legs loaded, its hindquarters dropped, its whole body gathered to run. The exact sequence of a prey animal that has just understood it needs to leave right now. The reaction was fast. Any predator that Forrest had, mountain lion, bear, wolf, would have watched the deer clear the gap. Bigfoot was already there before the deer's legs could fire. What happened at the moment of contact was the part of the footage that made every person who watched it go quiet. Bigfoot did not drive the deer to the ground, did not crash into it, did not do what any predator in that ecosystem would do, use body mass and impact to bring it down. Instead, in one motion, flowing directly out of the sprint, Bigfoot reached down with one arm and simply picked the deer up. One arm, one motion. A 90-pound animal in full panic, legs pumping against nothing, throwing its body weight in every direction, and Bigfoot absorbed all of it without breaking stride. The deer ended up tucked under Bigfoot's arm like a carried object, controlled and going nowhere, while Bigfoot crossed the remaining stretch of riverbank and hit the tree line at the same speed it had been running since the cedar. By the time it reached the trees, nothing about the way it moved suggested it was carrying anything at all, just the deer's legs sticking out, still kicking, and the sounds the deer was making, still audible on the camera's microphone until the forest took both of them. 31 seconds from Bigfoot's first appearance to the moment the trees closed behind it. The camera kept recording for 2 more minutes after that, showing nothing but the empty riverbank and the slow-moving water. The section of the bank where the deer had been drinking looked completely undisturbed. No blood, no tracks scattered in panic patterns, no fur or debris of the kind any other predator encounter leaves behind. The scene looked almost exactly the same as it had before any of it occurred, which was its own kind of disturbing because it meant this was practiced. A cleanup this complete, an exit this clean and fast, did not happen by accident the first time. And if it was not the first time, then this river crossing had a history that nobody had been present to document. The deer that had come to this water source over months and years before Thomas's camera arrived had come and gone from a crossing that was being hunted regularly, and no evidence of any of it had been left behind for anyone to find. Thomas watched the clip 7 times before he drove back to Seattle. He spent the first full day running every check he knew from 2 decades of documentary work. The hair moved differently on different parts of Bigfoot's body, the strands across its shoulders responding to the breeze differently than the thicker matted sections lower down its arms, exactly the way real hair of different lengths behaves in wind. Beneath the hair, the muscles of its shoulders and upper back were visibly working as it ran, in the same shifting, rolling pattern that any large running animal produces. During the stillness behind the cedar, Bigfoot's chest rose and fell with its breathing. He spent a long time on the hands. The grip on the cedar trunk was 5-fingered, each finger fully wrapped around the bark, with a span that no human hand came close to matching. The single-arm scoop that lifted a panicked 90-pound animal mid-sprint, one smooth downward motion, complete control, no visible exertion, no change in pace. Thomas had spent 20 years filming large animals. He understood enough about what bodies could and could not do to know that what he had just watched placed Bigfoot in a category of physical strength that nothing he had ever filmed belonged to. He ran the speed numbers multiple ways. The distance from the cedar to the deer was 40 feet, a measurement he had made himself on his last visit to the location. Bigfoot had covered that distance in under 3 seconds, starting from a complete standstill, maintaining that speed through the grab, and through carrying a struggling animal all the way to the forest edge. The numbers he kept arriving at were somewhere between 25 and 28 miles per hour. Bigfoot's estimated weight, based on body proportions, put it in the same class as a large male grizzly bear. A grizzly's top sprint is faster, but only over short distances and with nothing to carry. The combination of that speed, that weight, and that grip strength while managing a 90-pound struggling animal had no match in any wildlife data Thomas could find. But the speed, by the time he had finished analyzing the 17 seconds, was almost beside the point. He reached out to a wildlife biologist he had worked with before, someone who ran an independent research station near Ashford and had a reputation for careful, skeptical work. The biologist watched the footage, asked for a second copy, and called Thomas back the same evening. The call went on for 2 hours. What the biologist kept returning to was not the speed or the strength, it was the 17 seconds. Those 17 seconds had no match anywhere in the documented behavior of large North American predators. Not bears, not mountain lions, the most patient ambush hunters in the region. Nothing in their behavioral records showed what the footage showed. Deliberate selection of a specific piece of cover based on the prey's approach direction, holding that position through 2 alert responses without a single movement, and timing the launch to the exact moment of maximum exposure. That was not predatory instinct, that was a hunting strategy. The biologist said those words carefully. Not a behavior, not a reflex, not an instinct, a strategy. Then the biologist brought up the cedar tree itself, and this was the point in the analysis where the question shifted from what Bigfoot could do to what Bigfoot knew. That game trail was old. The path had been worn into the soil by deer and elk, using the same route to the same water source for so many generations that it looked carved. Any large animal spending regular time in that forest would have crossed that trail many times and would have seen deer and elk using it repeatedly. The cedar Bigfoot used for cover was the single best concealment position at that approach angle, the only piece of cover that worked from the direction the deer had come from. To have chosen it, Bigfoot had to have known in advance which direction the deer would come from. That was not something figured out in the moment. That was accumulated knowledge of a specific hunting ground, built through repeated experience in that specific territory, which meant this was not Bigfoot's first hunt at this crossing, which meant Bigfoot had been hunting this river crossing from that cedar using that game trail long before Thomas's camera arrived, long before Thomas had ever been in this forest. And the deer that had come to this water source over those months and years had no idea what was waiting for them because Bigfoot had never given them a reason to find out. The biologist flagged one more thing in a follow-up call 3 days later. The deer had actually paused twice on its approach, once at the tree line, again at about 15 feet from the bank, rotating its ears and lifting its nose, doing the careful scanning of an animal that has registered something vaguely wrong without being able to identify a specific threat. The deer had, on some level, sensed something was there, and Bigfoot had held perfectly frozen through both of those moments. Not a twitch, not a readjustment. Nothing that let the deer's alarm system lock on and confirm. The biologist said he had spent years studying predator-prey dynamics in Pacific Northwest forests and had never documented any large predator with the impulse control to hold position through 2 close-range alert responses. That level of control, he said, was not something animals had. It was something that thinking things had. Thomas reached out to a second expert, a video forensics specialist who ran a small independent lab outside of Olympia and had done authenticity work on documentary footage before. He sent the full video file with all of the camera's built-in data left intact, the compression information, the timestamps from the internal clock, the GPS location data written directly into the file. He asked for a complete analysis and deliberately did not tell the technician anything about what the footage showed. The technician came back 8 days later with a full report. It went through every technical indicator of digital manipulation that video forensics tools could detect. How compression artifacts behaved across the file, whether the timestamps matched up correctly, how motion blur worked at the edges of the moving subject, whether the lighting stayed consistent as Bigfoot moved from shadow into the early morning light near the river, whether shadow directions matched the actual sun position for that timestamp, and GPS location. The report found 0 indicators of manipulation. Everything was consistent with genuine footage captured by that camera model under those lighting conditions on that morning. The technician added a personal note at the end. If someone had faked the footage, they would have needed to do it at a level of technical skill beyond anything achievable with standard equipment, and would have needed to know the exact position of a hidden elk camera, the exact time a deer would approach that crossing, and the exact quality of the light that specific morning. The simpler explanation, the technician wrote, was that the footage was real. Thomas presented the clip at a closed cryptozoology conference in British Columbia in December 2016. He put together a presentation that included the raw clip, his own frame-by-frame breakdown, and both independent expert reports. He had decided going in that he was not going to try to push the audience toward any particular conclusion. No dramatic voiceover, no leading questions, no attempt to get ahead of what people were thinking while they watched. He showed the clip, shared the data, and let the 31 seconds do the work. The response was the kind of divided, tense silence that precedes serious argument, because everyone in that room understood what the hunting sequence meant. Not a large primate opportunistically finding food. An apex predator with a defined method, deep territorial knowledge, and physical capabilities that placed it above every other predator in the Olympic Peninsula. The researchers who had spent years building behavioral evidence for Bigfoot's existence understood right away what they were looking at. The skeptics focused on what was missing: no carcass, no hair, no castable prints. Footage alone had never been considered enough. But underneath both reactions was the question that the hunting sequence actually raised, the one that did not resolve into either category. Not whether the footage was real, not whether more evidence was needed. How long had something with that level of hunting intelligence been operating in that forest, using those specific crossings, making decisions based on that specific territorial knowledge? And how many other forests were there, with their own crossings and their own cedar trees, where the same thing had been happening without a single trail camera ever being in the right place at the right time? Thomas announced at the conference that he was going back to the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 2017 with a small team and proper search equipment, with the goal of finding physical evidence at and around the site. He was not done with the Hoh River corridor. Whatever had been using that cedar as a regular hunting position had been doing it before his camera arrived, and he believed it was still doing it. The spring 2017 trip brought him back to the river crossing with a 3-person team and equipment that included sensors for detecting buried organic material and dogs trained to locate wildlife remains. They searched the area around the cedar for 4 full days, expanding outward in the direction Bigfoot had gone when it left the frame. They found disturbed vegetation in a pattern consistent with the exit path. They found 1 partial impression in soft ground near the river's edge, too weathered to cast, but large enough and correctly oriented to be consistent with a very large bipedal footprint. That was it. The forest had done what Pacific Northwest old growth does. 4 months of rain and heavy biological activity had broken down and absorbed whatever evidence had been there. Nothing was left to recover. Thomas came back to Seattle with the spring findings and added them to the file he had been building since November. The partial imprint photographs, the mapped vegetation disturbance, the forensic lab report, the biologist's behavioral analysis, the speed and strength breakdown from his frame-by-frame work on the original footage. He compiled it into a single document and sent copies to the small group of researchers he trusted to handle it seriously. In September 2017, he returned again. He set cameras at 12 locations within a 2-mile radius, not to catch Bigfoot directly, because he had already understood that the original clip had only happened because the camera was there for elk. Whatever awareness Bigfoot had about human activity in its territory put it at a permanent advantage over any camera placed deliberately to find it. He went back to understand the territory, what Bigfoot used, how it moved through the forest over time. The cameras ran through fall and into early winter 2017. Several captured elk footage exactly as planned. One caught a black bear working a section of riverbank about half a mile north of the original location. 3 recorded nothing except the forest changing light and weather across the recording window. One camera, set up on a ridge overlooking the river corridor about 3/4 of a mile southeast of the cedar tree, caught something on the evening of October 19th, 2017. Something large and upright, moving through the thick undergrowth at the top of the ridge with the steady, unhurried pace of an animal that was not startled and was not in any rush to get somewhere. It was in the frame for less than 4 seconds, and the low light had pushed the image quality down to the point where specific details were hard to make out. But the shape was the same. The silhouette, how wide the shoulders were, how long the arms were compared to the rest of the body height, the 2-legged stride, matched what Thomas had spent the better part of a year studying in careful detail from the November 2016 clip. Whatever had used that cedar tree as a hunting blind was still in that forest almost a year later, still moving through it, still unhurried, still invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile grid, and only caught it all because one unit happened to be pointed at the right ridge at the right moment. Thomas added the clip to his file and made the hardest professional decision of his career. He chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, because a year of working through the behavioral evidence in the original footage had brought him to a specific conclusion about what kind of intelligence was operating in the Hoh River corridor. And that conclusion made him genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of directing more human attention into the territory it was living in. The 31 seconds had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. By the end of 12 months, it had become a question about what happens when something that intelligent, that capable, that practiced in remaining invisible, what happens when the world finds out exactly where it is. The November 2016 footage showed something faster than every other animal in that forest, stronger than every other animal in that forest, patient enough to hold 17 seconds of perfect voluntary stillness while a prey animal closed the distance, strategic enough to have chosen its hide based on advanced knowledge of how that specific animal would approach that specific water source. It had taken a 90-pound deer in a single-arm grab at full sprint, disappeared into old-growth timber in 31 seconds, and left a scene so undisturbed that the river crossing looked exactly as it had before any of it occurred. That footage, 31 seconds on a November morning by the Hoh River, remained the most complete behavioral documentation of Bigfoot ever captured. Not because of what it showed about Bigfoot's size or appearance, because of what those 17 seconds of total stillness before the sprint revealed about what was happening behind its eyes. The speed was extraordinary, the strength was extraordinary, but the plan, the selection of that cedar at that angle, based on that knowledge of that trail, was what put this footage in a different category from every piece of Bigfoot evidence that had come before it. What Thomas Bannister's trail camera caught on November 3, 2016, was not a Bigfoot sighting. It was a predator operating inside a territory it understood completely, faster than everything else in that forest, stronger than everything else in that forest, invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile search grid for the entire following year, and apparently aware enough of human activity in its range to have adjusted its behavior accordingly. The 31 seconds of footage had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. The year that followed turned it into a question Thomas eventually decided he was not willing to answer out loud. What would happen to that territory and to what was living in it if the rest of the world came to understand exactly what it was capable of? He had a second clip. He kept it to himself, and the Hoh River corridor kept going, old growth and rain and game trails worn deep into the earth. And somewhere in it, if the October 2017 footage meant what Thomas believed it meant, the cedar tree by the river crossing was still there and still being used, and the deer still had no idea. My name is Kale Broeder. I'm an experienced outdoorsman. I know the Pacific Northwest forests better than most and have spent decades in terrain that breaks people. It was a remote logging road in late autumn, the kind of place that swallows sound, where mist hangs low enough to obscure the canopy, where cell signal is theoretical on the best days and non-existent on most. I was scouting abandoned trails for a project I still won't specify. I've learned that specificity costs pieces of safety, and I want to tell you the whole architecture of this, even if some rooms stay locked. I've been in woods that felt wrong before, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen, like the trees were positioned specifically to block your view of whatever moved behind them. This wasn't that. This felt occupied, not haunted, not threatening, not even particularly watchful, just occupied. Like walking into a room where someone was working and stopping because you recognized you didn't belong there. The engine trouble started without warning. My truck, maintained obsessively, suddenly sputtered, died, sat silent for 90 seconds, then restarted as if nothing had happened. I checked everything I could check without tools. Nothing wrong. My phone showed full battery, zero signal, in a place where I should have had 2 bars, minimum. I reached for my camera then, not out of excitement. I know the difference between the thrill of discovery and the dread of needing to prove to your future self that you weren't hallucinating. I needed evidence because I already didn't trust what my eyes were receiving. The movement through the trees, I saw size that didn't match any bear I'd ever encountered, speed that didn't match any known animal, a fluidity that suggested something comfortable in that terrain in ways no human could replicate, not a glimpse, a presence, deliberate, aware of me in return. I pressed record. The figure appeared in the first seconds of footage, moving parallel to the road, maybe 60 feet into the tree line, keeping just inside the darkest bands of the mist-filtered light in a way that seemed practiced, not instinctive, not the random movement of an animal threading through undergrowth, but deliberate use of shadow, tracking along the road, aware of the truck, adjusting its position relative to both in a way that suggested not instinct, but decision-making. The size was the first thing that stopped making sense. I have encountered every large animal that lives in those forests, and I have never once misjudged a bear. This was not a bear. The proportions were wrong in too many specific ways for that explanation to survive even a second of scrutiny. The arm length, I can still see it in my memory with a clarity I wish I could transfer into words, suggested a span that would require a body architecture that simply does not exist in any animal I have ever studied. The way it moved carried weight in the wrong places, distributed differently than any quadruped or known biped, the stride covering ground in a way that I kept trying to parse against known gaits and kept failing. It moved through that terrain like it belonged to it completely. Like every root and depression and angled branch was information it had processed long before I arrived. I was whispering into the microphone, not commentary, not narration for any imagined audience. Just words escaping without decision, the sound of a person trying to stay rational against the pull of what they're witnessing, describing what I was seeing out loud because that was the only way I knew to test whether it was real. Then it stopped, complete stillness, in the way that no animal stops, not a deceleration, not a weight shift, but a switch thrown. And in the silence of that stop, it turned. The head first, then the body following in a slow rotation that was entirely deliberate, and it looked directly at me. Through the windshield, through the lens. The eyes reflected light differently than anything I have ever filmed. Not the flat mirror flash of deer in headlights, not the greenish return of nocturnal animals. Something warmer and more complex. And behind those eyes, I know how this sounds, there was assessment, not the blank registering of a threat stimulus you see in animals. Something that looked, across the full 10 seconds, we held each other's attention, like the thing behind those eyes was performing an evaluation, taking in information, reaching a conclusion. I held completely still. I think I stopped breathing. The figure looked at me, finished looking, and returned its attention to the forest. The movement communicated as clearly as any gesture I have ever witnessed that it had seen me, classified me, and decided what to do with that information. The decision appeared to be, continue. I breathed. I kept filming. For several more minutes, the figure moved through the trees in that same measured way, occasionally pausing, occasionally looking back at me with that same evaluating stillness. I kept the camera on it and kept whispering into the microphone and kept trying to make sense of what I was watching. The mist shifted around it as it moved, thickening in some places and thinning in others, and the figure navigated those changes the way you navigate a familiar room in the dark, without hesitation, without recalculating, with the ease of something that had been moving through this specific forest in this specific kind of light for long enough that the fog was just another condition it had learned to use. I was aware, in a way I couldn't fully articulate, that I was watching something go about its morning. That, whatever I had interrupted by turning onto that road, it was still happening, just with me added to the edges of it. That I was a variable it had assessed and filed and moved on from, and the moving on was not indifference, but confidence. It didn't need to watch me because it had already decided I wasn't a threat. I'm not sure, even now, whether that should have reassured me or frightened me more than everything else. The silence was the other thing. Real wilderness is never fully quiet. There are always birds, insects, the creak of trees, the small sounds of things moving through undergrowth. That road had gone completely still from the moment I turned onto it. No birds, nothing. Just the low sound of the truck's engine and my own breathing and the almost imperceptible sound of movement through the trees 60 feet away. The absence of everything else felt deliberate, like the forest itself had cleared out, like whatever was in those trees had a radius of silence that traveled with it. Then I heard the sounds, a distant mechanical rhythm, low and regular, then radio static, not the fuzz of a consumer device, but something structured, bursts at intervals, a specific frequency, and voices briefly at a volume and tone that suggested people trained to communicate efficiently in environments where sound traveled. Short, practiced, the communication of people who had worked together long enough to need very few words. I panned the camera toward the sounds. In doing so, I caught what I had almost missed. Flashlights appearing in the mist to the north, not searching in the loose arcs of someone exploring, moving in lines, in coordination, cutting through the fog with direction and absolute purpose. Then the figures emerged from the tree line. And look, while putting this story together, we went even deeper. There are others, same roads, same teams, same procedure. We documented everything. The cases, the patterns, the names that keep appearing, all of it is compiled in one place. The link is in the description. Dark clothing, nothing reflective, no visible insignia on anything I could make out from my distance and in that light. 4 that I could count in the initial emergence, spaced at intervals that were clearly deliberate, not the casual spread of a group moving through woods together, but an intentional geometric arrangement, each position relative to the others, calculated to cover angles and close corridors. What struck me, watching them move through the mist and into the open ground near the road, was how little they looked at anything directly. Their eyes moved in patterns, scanning arcs, checking positions, reading the tree line, in a way that suggested training rather than curiosity. They weren't looking for the creature, they knew where it was. They were reading the terrain around it, checking for variables, confirming that the situation matched whatever map of it they had built in advance. They moved into their placements, without discussion, without hesitation, each person arriving at a position that had clearly been assigned before any of them set foot on that road. I pressed myself back against my seat. I was certain in that moment that one of them would turn toward my truck, that the camera through the windshield would catch the light and draw attention, that my presence, undisguised and impossible to miss, would interrupt what was unfolding in front of me. None of them looked at me, not once. I kept filming. The creature registered the team before they were fully positioned. I watched it happen in real time through my lens. A change in posture, a raising of the head that picked something from the air and translated it instantly into a different quality of attention. It turned toward the lights, and what I saw in that turn, what I have spent years trying to find words for, was not confusion, not the bewilderment of an animal encountering something outside its experience. It was recognition. The recognition of something that knew specifically what the arrival of organized humans in formation meant, what it had always meant, what was about to happen. It moved. Faster than anything that size should be capable of, covering ground in a burst that made me revise, in real time, everything I thought I understood about what speed was possible in a creature of that mass. It went for the southern tree line in a straight line, committed and explosive. Two of the figures were already there, not running to intercept, already positioned, before the creature moved, as if they had known which direction it would choose, which gap it would read as the exit, which angle instinct would send it toward, as if that choice was part of a pattern they had observed enough times to predict and plan around. The creature changed direction without slowing. It pivoted with an agility that made the word feel inadequate, and the fourth figure, who I had lost track of during the repositioning, who I hadn't been able to locate in the trees, was already covering that angle too. I understood, watching this unfold, that I was not watching a hunt. I was watching a procedure. What followed was the longest 11 minutes of my life. They deployed equipment I had no names for. Cases that had been carried in now opened into things with no civilian reference point. Components assembled in sequences that suggested regular repetition, handled with the ease of tools so familiar they required no thought. Lines or cables with handheld components, a larger device that required two operators and was partially obscured by both the figures and the thickening mist. Communication in gestures that had their own vocabulary, brief and precise, the shorthand of a team that had built a language together through repetition. The creature fought with everything it had. I need you to understand the scale of what I mean, because the word fight doesn't carry the right weight by itself. When it made first contact with the nearest figure, absorbing something that had been deployed, cables or lines catching and tightening, the force of its response traveled through the ground and through the frame of my truck and into the seat beneath me and into my hands on the camera. A low-frequency shudder, structural, the kind of vibration you feel in your back teeth. Whatever it weighed, whatever force it could generate, I felt it from 60 feet away through 2 tons of vehicle. The team had anticipated this. They distributed the resistance across the group rather than concentrating it, used the equipment in sequences that had clearly been ordered in advance, adapted around the force rather than attempting to meet it directly. They were calm in a way that was more unnerving than aggression would have been. The calm of people who had accounted for this level of resistance in their planning, who had faced it before. The creature changed tactics. I want to be precise about that word, and I stand behind it. Tactics, not just directionless struggle against restraint, but a sequence of attempts that changed when each failed, that tested for openings with evident intelligence behind the testing, that worked through the problem rather than simply reacting to pain. It found a gap in the formation. Briefly, I saw it happen, saw the figures scramble in a way they hadn't scrambled before, saw the momentary collapse of the geometric precision they'd maintained throughout. Something was exchanged between two of them in a tone I hadn't heard yet, carrying a note of controlled urgency beneath the professional flatness. And then the creature drove through that gap with everything it had left. I want to slow down here because this is the moment I have replayed more than any other in the years since, the moment where the outcome felt genuinely uncertain for the first and only time. The two figures who should have been covering that angle were still recovering their positions. I could see them moving, could see the gap between them that was still wide enough, still open. The creature hit that opening at full speed, body low, arms driving, moving with a desperation that was different from anything it had shown in the minutes before. Not tactics anymore, pure commitment. The kind of movement that comes from knowing that this is the last chance and spending everything on it without reservation. I was holding my breath so hard, my vision was starting to narrow at the edges. For 4, maybe 5 seconds. I genuinely thought it was going to make it. The gap was still there. The figures were still a step behind. The tree line was close, 30 feet, maybe less. And if it reached those trees at that speed, in that terrain, I believed with everything I had that nothing on that road was going to catch it. Then the figure I hadn't been tracking, the one I had lost in the repositioning, came from the left, not running, already in position, already there, in exactly the place the creature needed to be empty. The formation hadn't collapsed. It had shifted, and the shift had been designed to funnel the escape attempt directly into a position they had already filled. The gap closed. The window was gone. The creature pulled up hard against the reformed line, and the force of the stop shook my truck again from 60 feet away. A second impact through the frame and into my teeth, and whatever hope had briefly existed in those 5 seconds went out like a switch thrown. It had never been close. They had made it look close. I understood that now, in the sudden, terrible clarity of watching the formation reset with total calm. No urgency, no sign that any of it had been in doubt. They had let the gap open. They had allowed the attempt. Whether to exhaust it or to learn something from the direction it chose, I don't know. What I know is that the scrambling I had read as their mistake had been part of the procedure too. I kept filming. My hands were shaking worse than they had been before. Then the second device was deployed. The larger one, the 2-person operation. I still couldn't see it fully, positioned at the far edge of my visible frame, half obscured by figures and mist. What I could see were its effects, and the effects were gradual in a way that made them harder to watch than something sudden would have been. The creature's movement changed by degrees, slowed, not stopped, not all at once, but drained, like something being drawn down rather than struck down. The force behind each attempt at the restraints diminished, the reach diminished, the speed diminished. What remained, as the figure finally went to the ground, was a process I am not going to be able to describe adequately, and I know that, but I am going to try anyway, because it is the part that has stayed with me longest and most completely. It took a long time, longer than you would expect. The going down was not a collapse. It was a series of smaller losses. Each one resisted, and then surrendered, and then resisted again at the next level, like something that understood exactly what each stage of losing meant and chose to make each one cost as much as possible. Even when the strength was almost gone, it was still making choices. The position of its body, what it braced against, where it directed the last of what it had. It went down the way something goes down when it has decided that surrender is not the same as defeat, that how you lose is the only thing left you can control. I was still filming, camera against the steering wheel, breathing too loud, the counter reading 15 minutes, 15:30, 16. I remember watching that counter and feeling the specific dread of something ending, not the operation, which was clearly concluding with total efficiency, but something larger. The creature going down in those trees was not just a capture, it was a removal. It was the subtraction of something from a world that had contained it, quietly and without anyone's knowledge, for longer than I could calculate, and the people doing the subtracting had done it before, would do it again, and would leave that road exactly as they had found it, with no trace and no record, and nothing to suggest that anything had ever happened there at all, except for 17 minutes on my camera, except for me. They moved the creature toward an opening in the vegetation to the north, an opening I only now fully registered had been made, not natural. Branches cut or bent back, undergrowth cleared, the gap shaped to specific dimensions, prepared before the operation began. Before I turned onto that road, the vehicle waiting inside it had been positioned there in advance, its engine at low idle, its lights directed inward. They knew exactly where they were bringing it. They had measured the space they would need. Every element, the geometric deployment, the equipment sequences, the predicted escape angles, the manufactured gap in the formation, the prepared exit had been thought through somewhere else by someone I would never see, who had looked at a map and a date and said, here and now. It took 4 of them to move it, and even in that condition, it required their full effort. I filmed the last of it from as stable a position as I could manage. The counter read 16 minutes, 16:40, 17. The last figure stepped through the gap in the vegetation. The engine sound deepened briefly and faded, moving away through trees on a route I couldn't see. The radio static cut. The mist settled back into a silence that was just silence now, just forest, just the ordinary sounds of a place returning to itself as if nothing had happened in it. 17 minutes and 4 seconds. I had filmed all of it. I sat for a moment just breathing, letting the silence confirm itself, letting my hands loosen slightly on the camera. What I had was everything. The approach, the formation, the struggle, the near escape that wasn't, the procedure, the removal. 17 minutes of footage that would, I was completely certain, change everything it touched. I set the camera on the passenger seat. I was already building the plan in my head. Drive until pavement, drive until signal, make copies immediately, multiple devices, multiple locations, running through the steps with the focused calm of someone who understands that the window between now and the first backup is the window of maximum vulnerability, that every minute the footage existed in only one place was a minute of unacceptable risk. I reached for the ignition key. I turned back to pick up the camera. The passenger seat was empty. I want you to sit inside that moment with me because I have spent years sitting inside it and I still cannot find the bottom of it. The seat was empty, not the camera on the floor, not slid into the gap beside the console. Empty. I ran my hand under the seat, checked the door pocket, checked everywhere a camera could physically travel from a bus, stationary position in the span of seconds it takes to reach for a key. Nothing. I got out of the truck without deciding to. I checked the ground around the entire vehicle. I opened the rear door. I looked in the bed. I did all of it in a state that wasn't yet panic, because panic requires accepting what the emptiness implied, and I hadn't accepted it yet. I was still in the stage where there was going to be an explanation, where I had set it somewhere else and was misremembering, where objects behaved the way objects behaved. There was no explanation, not one that obeyed the rules I understood. I stood on that road, silent, mist-covered, empty in every direction I could see, and I began, slowly and with great reluctance, to understand the rules I hadn't. They had known I was there from the beginning. I had already absorbed that much. What I hadn't absorbed was its full implication. Not just that they knew, but that the knowledge had been managed, that someone in that operation had been assigned specifically to the witness, not to confront me, not to approach me visibly, not to do anything that would appear in my camera's frame or register as movement at the edge of my vision, just to be close, to wait, positioned near my vehicle for the entire duration of those 11 minutes, through the approach, through the struggle, through the near escape, through all of it, producing no sound, no shadow at the window, no shift of light that would cause me to turn my head. Waiting for the moment, I set the camera down and looked away. I stood beside my truck and went back through every minute of what I had watched, searching for the moment I would have heard something near the vehicle. A footstep on gravel, a change in the way the light fell through the passenger window, the slight give of the truck's suspension under a hand pressed against it, a breath even, just the sound of another person existing in the fog within arm's reach of where I sat. I went back through it, second by second, trying to find the seam, the single moment that should have given it away. Nothing. Not one thing across 11 full minutes. No sound, no movement, no shadow, no vibration. And the longer I stood there reconstructing it, the more complete the nothing became. Not the nothing of absence, but the nothing of someone who had trained for exactly this, who had practiced producing exactly this quality of invisibility, who had stood in exactly this kind of fog beside exactly this kind of vehicle, and waited and been undetectable and known they would be. This was a skill. Someone had spent time developing it specifically for situations like this one. The absence I was trying to find a crack in wasn't accidental. It had been constructed. Less than 10 seconds. That was the window I had given them, the span between setting the camera on the passenger seat and reaching toward the ignition. Someone had waited through 11 minutes of everything that happened on that road. The struggle, the near escape, the going down, all of it. For a 10-second window they were certain would come. That was the confidence they had in how I would behave. That was how completely I had been accounted for before I ever turned onto that road. And they had been right. I got back in the truck. I looked at the empty passenger seat. The mist sat on the tree line where the gap had been, where the vehicle had waited, where the creature had gone. Just trees now, just fog, just a road that had already forgotten what happened on it. I started the engine and I drove, and I did not look in my mirrors. I had 17 minutes. I set the camera down for 10 seconds. They had been waiting for exactly that long. The AI wasn't asked to confirm anything. It was tasked with a much harder job: find the inconsistencies. Feed it the evidence and let it do what it was built to do: detect deception, flag fabrication, and surface the cracks that human researchers tend to miss or overlook. If any part of this story was falling apart, the system would find it. What it returned instead was the opposite of that. Not a case unraveling, but a case snapping together Bigfoot footage with 48 years of Ohio history that nobody had ever bothered to connect. The 8 witnesses who came forward during the March 2026 flap were not the kinds of people who go looking for Bigfoot on weekends. They were hikers, dog walkers, a mother and daughter who were just driving along Route 303, and a woman near Lake Milton who was out for an evening walk. None of them had a history of paranormal claims. None of them were affiliated with any Bigfoot research group. Several of them were reluctant to talk at all because they were aware of how the story would sound to their neighbors, their co-workers, their families. What the AI came back with across all 8 interviews was striking on multiple levels. First, there were no significant performance indicators. The stress patterns in the witnesses' voices were consistent with genuine fear responses, not the elevated but controlled presentation you see when someone is telling a story they've rehearsed or embellished. These people sounded, at least to the AI, like they had been genuinely frightened by something. If they weren't acting, then what exactly caused that level of fear? Second, and more importantly, several very specific details appeared independently across witnesses who had no way of knowing what the others had said. The shoulder rotation was one of them. Multiple witnesses described the creature they saw turning its upper body to look in a direction without its neck moving the way a human neck would move, as though the head and neck were more fixed to the torso. That's a strange, specific detail. A stilt-like walking gait came up repeatedly as well, described in slightly different language across different interviews, but pointing at the same underlying motion. And the smell, a sharp, musky, ammonia-like odor, was reported by witnesses in different locations along the corridor. The AI's cross-witness consistency score for these interviews came back as atypically high for fabricated reports. That doesn't mean the AI declared the sightings real. What it means is that the level of specific, convergent detail across 8 independent accounts was statistically unusual in a way that deserved further attention rather than dismissal. There was also the matter of geography. When the AI mapped out the locations and timing of the 8 sightings, something emerged that wasn't random scatter. The reports moved in a pattern. Mantua, then Garrettsville, then Streetsboro, then Newton Township, then Lake Milton, a directional path running along the waterway and greenway system connecting those communities. The AI flagged this as a movement pattern consistent with territorial behavior rather than isolated, unconnected incidents. 8 witnesses, 5 days, 1 corridor, and not one of them knew the others existed. The AI had already flagged their consistency as statistically unlikely to be coincidence. But here is what made that flag mean something more than just an interesting data point about the spring of 2026. This wasn't the first time that corridor had produced this profile. 48 years before any of those 8 witnesses saw anything, a family in Stark County had already described the exact same smell, the exact same gait, and that exact same shoulder that turns without the neck following. And when the AI ran those archived interviews through the same analysis system, what it returned wasn't just a similarity, it returned a match. If the same profile existed decades earlier, then how long has this been happening unnoticed? In the summer of 1978, the Caton family, who lived on a rural property near Minerva in Stark County, Ohio, began experiencing something that disrupted their lives for weeks. A large, bipedal figure was repeatedly seen near their home and outbuildings, close enough on several occasions that family members got extended looks at it. The encounters were frightening enough that they eventually contacted local law enforcement. Deputies came out and walked the property. They didn't find the creature, but they did document something: a strong, distinctive ammonia-like smell in the areas where the figure had reportedly been seen. The Caton family case became one of the most discussed Bigfoot incidents in Ohio history, largely because it had law enforcement involvement and multiple witnesses across multiple nights. But over the decades, it got filed away as regional folklore. An interesting story, maybe even a credible one, but ultimately unverifiable and frozen in time. What the AI did with those archived interviews was run them through the exact same behavioral and descriptive analysis framework it had used on the 2026 witnesses. It was looking at the same markers, stress patterns, credibility indicators, the specificity and internal consistency of sensory descriptions. And across the Caton family's accounts from 1978, the same cluster of details came back. The ammonia odor, the bipedal gait that witnesses struggled to describe as quite human. And the shoulder rotation, that same specific physical characteristic of a creature whose upper body seemed to move differently than a human body does. The AI flagged the sensory and behavioral descriptors across the 1978 and 2026 reports as consistent with each other in a way that pointed toward the same biological profile. When it calculated the probability of those specific overlapping details arising from independent fabrications, accounts separated by nearly 5 decades, created by people who had no connection to each other, the result came back low. Not impossible, but low enough to be notable. The same smell and the same gait. The same shoulder that turns without the neck following. The AI didn't know those details came from 48 years apart when it first processed them. It just kept flagging them as the same profile. And when a trail camera in Salt Fork State Park captured something crossing a creek in 2014, the system had already built a file on this profile. It just hadn't connected the footage yet. What would happen once the footage was finally linked to it? Salt Fork State Park sits in Guernsey County in eastern Ohio and covers more than 17,000 acres, making it the largest state park in Ohio. It also has one of the highest concentrations of Bigfoot reports in the state, a fact that tends to get treated as a joke in casual conversation and a data point worth taking seriously in research circles. In 2014, a trail camera positioned near a creek crossing captured footage of a large bipedal figure moving through the frame at night. When the AI analyzed the Salt Fork footage, it focused on what could be measured rather than what could be interpreted. Limb proportions were calculated and compared against known human ranges. The arm length relative to leg length, the width of the shoulders relative to overall height. The subject in the footage fell outside normal human proportions in multiple measurements. The AI also looked for what researchers call costume compensation patterns, the subtle behavioral adjustments that someone in a bulky, restrictive suit tends to make unconsciously, the slight hesitations and balance corrections that are hard to eliminate no matter how practiced you are. The Salt Fork footage returned no detectable costume compensation. The movement was fluid and consistent with a subject whose body proportions matched its movement, not a human body constrained by an exterior disguise. A trail camera captures what it captures and asks no questions. The AI asked them instead, and what it returned about the Salt Fork subject wasn't a verdict. It was the beginning of a file that kept getting thicker. 2 years later, a hiker in Hocking Hills State Park in Hocking County pointed a phone camera at something moving through dense brush on a trail above them. The footage was shaky, brief, and immediately questioned by anyone who saw it, because shaky phone footage of a dark figure in a forest is exactly what a person faking a Bigfoot encounter would produce. But when the AI analyzed the Hocking Hills footage, it wasn't looking at the image quality. It was looking at what it could measure despite the image quality. Stride length was isolated and calculated against the slope of the terrain the subject was moving across. The figure's stride was inconsistent with human gait on that particular incline, too long and distributed across the foot in a way that suggested a different skeletal structure in the lower leg and foot. More interesting was the behavioral analysis. The subject showed no awareness of the observer. There was no pause, no glance toward the camera, no change in pace or direction in response to the sound of the phone footage being taken. The AI flagged this specifically as an absence of observer awareness and an absence of performance behavior. The subject was simply moving through an environment it apparently knew well, with no indication that it registered being watched. If it didn't even react to being filmed, what does that say about how often it moves through areas without being seen? It didn't know it was being filmed. That behavioral signature would come up again 4 years later on a road in Portage County at speed in the middle of the night, caught not by a hiker with a phone, but by a dashboard camera that was never pointed at anything important. The Headwaters Trail dash cam footage from 2023 came from a driver traveling a Portage County Greenway road late at night. A large figure crossed the road ahead of the vehicle at speed, passing through the headlight beams and off into the tree line. The AI used the vehicle's speed and the crossing time to calculate the subject's pace, and from that and the frame data, it estimated the subject's height at around 7.5 feet. What the behavioral analysis flagged, in addition to the size, was the subject's complete non-reaction to the headlights. No flinch, no hesitation, no shielding of the eyes. Just a crossing, purposeful and unbothered, like something that had used that route before and had no particular reason to be startled by a car. 7.5 feet, crossing a road in Portage County without flinching at headlights. The AI had now logged the same biological profile in 3 separate Ohio locations across 9 years, but it hadn't yet seen the Portage County footage filmed 3 days into the 2026 flap, the footage shot by someone who had no idea what they were looking at. That footage is what changed everything, because when the AI finished analyzing it, it didn't just flag an unknown subject. It connected every single data point in the file. If all of this was leading somewhere, what would happen when the final piece was added? On March 7, 2026, one day after the first sighting report from the 2026 flap, an anonymous witness captured 34 seconds of phone footage near Mantua Center in Portage County. The witness didn't come forward immediately, and when they did, they asked for their identity to be kept private. They had simply been in the right place at the wrong time and filmed something they couldn't explain before it moved out of frame. Skeptics were quick to dismiss the footage for reasons that were, at least on the surface, reasonable. It was shaky. It was brief. It showed up during an already active news cycle about Bigfoot sightings in the exact area where it was filmed, which is exactly the kind of context that makes convenient footage look suspicious. 34 seconds of blurry phone video from a person who won't give their name, filmed during what was already being called a Bigfoot flap. That's not an easy sell. The AI didn't care about any of that context. It processed what the footage contained and returned what the data showed. Despite the video quality, the system was able to isolate 11 analyzable stride frames from the footage. Across 9 of those 11 frames, it confirmed what's called a mid-tarsal break, a flex point in the middle of the foot that doesn't exist in normal human anatomy, but has been documented in castings of alleged Bigfoot tracks for decades. This isn't something a person faking footage would think to include in their walking style, and it's not something that's easy to fake convincingly over multiple frames. The shoulder width of the subject exceeded the maximum range for human skeletal structure. The arm-to-leg ratio came in at 0.91, which is outside normal human range and also outside the range for gorillas, the largest primates with well-documented proportions. The overall gait consistency score across the analyzed frames was 94.1%, which is high enough to indicate a subject moving naturally in a familiar environment rather than performing or navigating carefully. And across the entire footage sample, the AI detected 0 fabrication markers. Then the AI did what it had been building toward through every prior data set it had processed. It cross-referenced the Portage County footage against all the previous samples in the file in real time. Would the similarities hold or collapse? The morphological match to the Salt Fork State Park footage from 2014 came back at 89.2%. The match to the Hocking Hills hiker footage from 2019 was 87.6%. The match to the Headwaters Trail dashcam footage from 2023 was 90.8%. These are not certainty numbers. They're similarity scores, and the AI was clear about what they represent. But they're also not noise. Scores in that range, across footage collected across 12 years from 4 different locations, indicate a consistent biological profile rather than a series of unrelated incidents or unrelated subjects. The shoulder rotation that the 2026 eyewitnesses had independently described in their interviews, that specific physical characteristic of the upper body turning without the neck following, was visible in the stride mechanics of the Portage County footage when the AI analyzed it frame by frame. the same detail that the Caton family had described in 1978, that 8 witnesses in 2026 had independently reported, was showing up in the way the subject in the footage actually moved. The territorial behavior flagged from the ammonia odor and the movement corridor in the 2026 sighting reports mapped directly onto the geographic area where the footage was taken. And when the AI plotted all 4 footage samples against the Northeast Ohio Waterway and Greenway network, every single one of them fell within the same connected system of water corridors and greenway paths cutting through the region. The system flagged this as a habitual range rather than a series of isolated incidents, a defined area being used consistently by something that knew the territory. The population modeling piece was the part that tended to stop people. A territorial range of the size indicated by the data spread covering the distance between Salt Fork, Hocking Hills, and the Portage County corridor is too large to be explained by a single animal moving through. The AI's modeling suggested that a range this size, used with this consistency over 12+ years, is more consistent with multiple individuals maintaining established routes than with one creature wandering across half the state, not one animal passing through. A group with territory, with behavior patterns, with routes they return to. The AI's final classification on the Portage County footage and on the integrated data set as a whole was unknown great ape Ohio variant, regionally distinct from Pacific Northwest samples in its proportions and behavioral profile, internally consistent across a 12-year footage dataset and a 48-year witness record. The Portage County footage didn't open a new case. It closed a loop that started in a Stark County backyard in 1978, and the AI had the data to show exactly how the loop closed. Ohio was never taken seriously as Bigfoot territory because it wasn't the Pacific Northwest, and for a long time that assumption was enough to close the conversation before it started. But the AI didn't carry that assumption, and it didn't care about regional reputation when it processed the data it was handed. It was given witness interviews, trail camera stills, dash cam video, and 34 shaky seconds of phone footage shot near Mantua. And every single time it returned the same result: a real subject, real motion, a real environment, and no known biological classification that fits what the data describes. The corridor has been active for at least 48 years. Whatever is using it has been doing so quietly, consistently, and just far enough out of frame until now. I'm watching the clip from the beginning, and the trail looks empty. Clear sky through the canopy, maybe 60 degrees. The kind of October morning that makes you feel like you own the forest. My footsteps are steady. My breathing is calm. The GoPro captures everything with the crisp indifference of a machine that doesn't feel fear. And right there in the frame behind me, in the 10th minute, 43 seconds, about 40 yards away, something is standing completely still in the tree line. I didn't see it when I was walking. I see it now. Tall, dark, built like something that has never once been afraid of anything alive. Bigfoot had already been there for who knows how long, watching me move down that trail like it. Was studying how I walked. The shape of it is wrong in a way that's hard to explain without sounding like you've lost your mind. It wasn't the silhouette of a bear. It wasn't the broken canopy playing tricks on shadows. Sasquatch was upright, composed, and deliberately positioned just far enough inside the tree line to be invisible, unless you knew exactly what to look for. I've gone back to that frame dozens of times now, zooming in until the image breaks apart into pixels. And every time I come back to the same conclusion. Whatever was standing there, it had chosen that spot on purpose. There was nothing accidental about its position. The angle, the cover, the stillness, that takes thought. Back on the trail in real time, I had no idea. The footage shows me walking at a comfortable pace, occasionally glancing at the ground to watch my footing, pausing once to check my phone for a signal that wasn't there. Standard stuff. But the audio on the GoPro is better than I remembered. And when I crank the volume and listen closely, I can already hear it. Faint but rhythmic low-frequency clicks coming from somewhere in the trees to my left. It wasn't birds, nor insects. It was something deliberate, the kind of sound that lives at the bottom of your ear before it registers as a sound at all. Was that click meant to warn me or lure me? I remember stopping. The footage confirms it. I planted both feet and stood there for almost 20 seconds, head tilted, scanning the tree line to my left. Nothing moved, nothing was visible. And here's what gets me when I watch it back now. I was looking in exactly the wrong direction. Based on Bigfoot's position the first time the camera caught a glimpse of it, I have a feeling that the Sasquatch was behind me and slightly right, motionless, watching me search for it in the wrong quadrant of forest. I was so confident in my instincts pointing me left that I never thought to turn fully around. Sasquatch used that. Whether it was conscious misdirection or just patience, the result was the same. I looked, found nothing, and kept walking. That's when I reached up and adjusted the GoPro. The clip shows my hand crossing the lens, and for half a second, the camera tilts upward at about 30 degrees, catching the mid-canopy instead of the trail. And I have watched that half-second frame by frame more times than I can count, because that's when Bigfoot appears again. Higher now, not on the ground. Sasquatch is in the lower branches of a large oak, maybe 40 feet off the trail, perched in a position that makes zero anatomical sense for something that must weigh upward of 500 pounds. But there it is. And the face. The face is what I can't let go of. It's turned directly toward the camera, not toward me, toward the lens, as if it understood what the lens was. The eyes are deep set and dark, and there is nothing blank about them. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Bigfoot looked like it was thinking. I reattached the mount, the camera leveled back out, and the trail snapped back into frame. And immediately, the clicking returned. But this time, it was louder. The gap between each click had shortened, or maybe it was coming from closer, or both. My body language in the footage shifts visibly. My shoulders come up half an inch. My stride gets tighter. I start scanning left and right with short glances instead of steady forward focus. I know that posture. That's the posture of someone whose nervous system is sending massive red flags that their conscious brain hasn't sorted into words yet. I think that's the moment my instincts started clocking in ahead of my thoughts. I just hadn't caught up yet, and Bigfoot was still right there behind me, closing the gap by degrees. How much closer could it get before I realized I was being hunted? I've spent time in thick backcountry. I've camped alone at elevation, hiked out at 3 in the morning, navigated by feel more than once. The woods have never made me feel small. That changed on this trail, on this morning, and I can pinpoint the exact moment in the footage, the moment my stride broke. Not a stumble, not a stop. Just a half-second hesitation in the rhythm, the kind your body makes when the math stops adding up. One foot came down a little softer than it should have. I picked up my pace, not running, not yet, but moving with the kind of urgency that doesn't come from logic. It comes from somewhere older than logic. The footage starts to shake now. Not badly, just enough to tell you the gait has changed. I'm moving somewhere between a fast walk and a trot, and my head is doing that thing where it keeps flicking backward without fully committing to a look. I remember the feeling exactly. I wanted to look back, and I didn't want to look back, because somewhere in the meat of my brain, I already suspected that looking back would show me something I couldn't unsee. So I kept moving, and Bigfoot kept moving too. What happens next in the footage is the part I had to watch 4 times before I could accept what I was seeing. I had pushed my pace up to something close to a jog, and the camera was bobbing enough to make the background choppy, but not so choppy that you miss it. Behind me, maybe 30 feet back, a shape moves between 2 tree trunks. One smooth, unhurried stride. The spacing between those trunks was at least 8 feet across. Bigfoot cleared that gap in a single step. Not a leap, but just a step. And in the brief moment when the shape was fully visible between the trees, upright, broad, moving with the fluid indifference of something that does not need to rush, I could see it wasn't running. It was walking, just walking, keeping pace with a human jogging. I honestly think, watching it now, that Bigfoot could have caught me whenever it decided to. It was toying with me. That's the thought that sits in my chest like a stone. Was this predator simply patient, or testing me for something worse? Growing up Navajo, I'd been taught to trust the land and to respect what watches from it. Something about the clicks and low rustles behind me set my nerves screaming. I knew this forest better than most. Every fallen log, every narrow deer path was mapped in my head. If I stayed on the main paved trail, it would take at least 20 minutes to reach the parking area. But cutting through this older, tighter forest, I could shave off almost 10 minutes. 10 minutes didn't seem like much, but when Bigfoot is closing in at a pace you can't measure, 10 minutes could be the difference between getting out and getting caught. I made the turn without hesitation, but it wasn't just instinct. My feet carried me left before my mind even fully caught up. I cut hard off the main trail. There's a deer path I've used before, cuts diagonally through a section of older forest and shaves almost a quarter mile off the route back to the parking area. Tighter canopy, rougher ground, but faster if you know it. I knew it. I took it without slowing down, ducking the first low branch by memory and hitting the uneven ground of the old deer path at full stride. The terrain got worse immediately. Exposed roots, soft spots where the soil had gone damp from a creek runoff somewhere below. Branches at shin level that caught my feet if I wasn't lifting high enough. The GoPro captured all of it, the world swinging and jerking as I worked through the brush, my breathing now audible on the mic, ragged but controlled. And then the clicking stopped. Just stopped. Mid-sequence, as if a switch had been thrown. And the silence that replaced it was worse. Because silence in a forest that has been making sound means something decided to go quiet. I felt the change in the air before I processed the audio shift. Everything around me became very still in the way that prey animals go still when something large has just entered. Their space. What filled the silence instead was something lower, a rhythmic sound I don't have a clean word for. Not a vocalization, not a knock. More like a deep, resonant pressure that hit the chest before the ears. It was spaced out and deliberate. It felt less like communication and more like the sound of something that knew I could hear it and wanted me to know that. I'm not someone who leans into the dramatic, but I will say this plainly. It felt like Bigfoot was controlling the pace. Like the Sasquatch had shifted from observation to something more intentional and was marking time as it came. Was it orchestrating my every move, step by step? I was moving hard through the deer path when I made my worst decision. I slowed down, just a fraction, just enough to try to get a bearing on where the sound was coming from. And in that half second of reduced speed, I turned my head back over my left shoulder. The camera caught what my eyes caught. Bigfoot was there, not 30 feet back this time, not a silhouette between trees. Close enough that I could make out the mass of it moving through the brush toward me with a kind of steady, ground-eating locomotion that looked nothing like a run, but covered ground like one. Sasquatch wasn't hesitating. It wasn't stopping to observe. It was advancing. And the distance between us had collapsed to something that made the word escape feel suddenly fragile. I took off in a full sprint. No more pacing, no more managing my footing on the uneven ground. I just went, and I accepted every stumble and root catch as the cost of forward motion. The GoPro footage from this stretch is chaotic. Sky, ground, branches, blur. But there are frames where the background stabilizes just long enough to see behind me. And in 2 of those frames, Bigfoot is visible, moving through the brush in long, smooth strides, angled toward me, not away. Sasquatch wasn't spooked by the sprint. It responded to it. The pace increased. There was no frantic energy in those strides, no sign of exertion, just the mechanical, metronomic movement of something that was built for this, in terrain that it had known far longer than I had. And the scariest part? He was 10 feet away from me. I've never felt fear like that in my life. I want to be specific about that. I've been in situations in the backcountry that were objectively more dangerous. A rockfall at elevation, a flash flood in a desert canyon, a close encounter with a black bear that ended fine but escalated fast. In all of those, the fear was manageable because the threat followed rules I understood. This was different. This was the specific terror of being pursued by something that was better at the terrain than I was, faster than I was, and not behaving like anything I had a category for. How do you survive when the rules themselves have changed? Then the rocks started. The first one hit the ground to my right with a crack that I felt in my teeth. Not a random falling branch, not a tumbling stone dislodged by movement upstream. It came in from the side, horizontal, at knee height, and struck a root hard enough to split it. I didn't stop. The second one caught my shoulder. It wasn't massive, maybe the size of a baseball, but it hit with enough force to send a spike of pain down into my elbow and throw my balance just enough to make me grab a sapling for support. I used the sapling to pivot and keep my momentum going without going down. The third one caught me in the upper back, mid-stride, and that one nearly buckled me. Bigfoot was throwing them, not rolling them, not kicking them loose. Full on, actually throwing them. Overhead with accuracy, while in motion through heavy brush. I can't tell you exactly how I know the difference, but I know it the same way you know when a punch is aimed versus when it's wild. The rocks were landing in front of me, and beside me, and behind me, and the pattern wasn't random scatter, it was bracketing. Sasquatch was boxing in my path, throwing ahead of where I was headed to steer me. I stumbled over a root, went down on one knee, got back up in what felt like the same motion, and kept running. That's when it landed. Not as a thought at first, more as a sensation, a wrongness in the geometry of where I was versus where I should have been. I'd been running this deer path for almost 4 minutes, and I should have been breaking into the secondary fire road by now. I should have been able to see the open sky ahead through the canopy thinning. Instead, the trees were getting denser. The ground was rising. I was heading northeast instead of northwest, and the only way I had gotten there was by following the path of least resistance when the rocks came in from the sides. Had I already been trapped without realizing it? I wasn't escaping. I was being steered. Every time I'd had to dodge right when a rock hit my left when one hit ahead of me to the right. I had turned incrementally away from the exit. Sasquatch hadn't been trying to hit me cleanly. It had been redirecting me. The rocks were a herding tool. I was deep in the denser section of the forest now, the canopy thick enough that it had dropped the ambient light by a full level, and I had zero visual on any recognizable landmark. I was exactly where Bigfoot wanted me, and it stopped feeling like a chase. It started feeling like something else, something with an endpoint where I am deep in the forest, dead. I forced myself to stop running and think for 3 seconds. 3 seconds, which felt like 3 hours. I pulled up the mental map of the area. The creek ran south, the ridge was east, the parking lot was west and low. I needed to go downhill and left, regardless of what that put between me and whatever was in those trees. I adjusted course, pushing through brush now, instead of following the path, taking the harder route, because the harder route was the right one. Then the rocks stopped entirely, and Bigfoot closed the distance. I know this because I heard it. Not footsteps, not snapping branches, but a single heavy impact on the ground, maybe 15 feet behind me, like something had dropped its full weight forward in one lunge. The sound was so massive and so close that my legs nearly gave out. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I just pushed every last thing I had into my legs and ran harder than I have ever run in my life. And the GoPro footage confirms it. The camera shaking so violently that only every 4th or 5th frame is even decipherable. Was I about to find out just how close it could really get? The footage shows me stumbling badly over an exposed root, catching myself on a tree trunk with my forearm hard enough to leave a bruise that still hurts as I watch this. What the mic caught at that exact moment is something I've had to listen to a dozen times to fully accept. A sound directly behind me, guttural and low. Not a roar, not a scream, just a single deep exhalation of something that was right there. Not 30 feet back, not 20, it was right there. The GoPro audio puts it at maybe 8 feet. If I had gone down on that route, I don't think I would have gotten back up. I hit a slope without warning and went with it, half running, half sliding down a 15-foot grade of loose shale and dead leaves, grabbing at anything to stay upright. My right knee went into the ground, came back up, and I was still moving. That's what the body does when everything else switches off. The slope angled me south, and I took it, because south was away, and away was the only direction that mattered. Behind me on that slope, the footage catches a shape dropping into the upper edge of the frame. Not sliding, not stumbling. It was controlled. Sasquatch came down that grade like it had done it 1,000 times. The trees thinned just slightly ahead. Not a clearing, just older growth with more space between trunks. And I hit that section at full sprint. That's when Bigfoot made its move. The footage shows a shadow crossing fast from my right, cutting in at an angle, closing the gap with sudden acceleration I hadn't seen from it before. Sasquatch had been pacing itself. The whole time, it had been pacing itself. And now it wasn't. Could I survive a sudden burst from something built to outlast me? But before we get into that, you need to see this. Because I found something else while watching this footage. Evidence and more discoveries that I can't put on YouTube. Things that were taken down, ignored, or completely removed. I gathered everything into one file. If you want to see it, it's in the description. Now back to the story. I screamed. Didn't plan to. It just came out, raw and primal, captured perfectly on the GoPro mic. I cut left so hard my feet nearly crossed, and I almost went down, barely staying upright, through something closer to controlled falling than running. Bigfoot adjusted instantly. The footage shows the shadow shifting course to match me. The gap now under 20 feet. The canopy shaking from its movement overhead in one frame. Overhead, like it had used a low branch as a pivot point. The geometry of it didn't make sense for something that size, and it didn't matter because it was happening. My lungs were burning in a way I hadn't felt ever. The footing was wet from creek drainage seeping up through the soil, and every third step my foot slid before catching. I could feel Bigfoot back there, not as a sound anymore, but as pressure. The way air moves differently when something large displaces it. Sasquatch was close enough that I could feel the wake of it. I've told people this, and they look at me like I'm exaggerating. I'm not. A branch caught me across the face. When I ran directly into it full speed, split my lower lip, and filled my mouth with blood. I didn't slow down. My vision went briefly white at the edges, and I didn't slow down. The footage from this stretch is almost unusable, just violent shaking and strobing light through branches. But in one clear frame, you can see Bigfoot's arm, not its whole body. Its arm extended, reaching. It was close enough to reach. That frame is the one I can barely look at because the hand is open. I would have been gone. I don't know if I made a sound when I saw what was ahead. A gray light through the trees, diffuse, flat, the specific quality of light that means open sky and open ground. A clearing. I hit the brush at the edge without slowing, ducked under a low branch by instinct, and exploded out the other side at a dead sprint and ran directly into a human being. The collision was violent. I hit him shoulder first at full running speed, and we both went down, him backwards into a tarp of gear, me rolling hard over his torso and landing on my hands in the dirt. Two other men spun around at the sound, and for one suspended second, everybody froze. Me on the ground, blood on my lip, chest heaving, him flat on his back in his own equipment, the other two with their hands halfway to things at their hips. The gear on the tarp was not recreational. Poachers, mid-setup, and I had crashed into the middle of their operation like a man falling out of the sky. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then one of them barked something low at the others, and they all turned toward the tree line I'd just come through. I turned too. Nothing. No sound. No movement. No shape at the edge of the clearing. Bigfoot was gone. Fully, completely gone. As if the sight of armed humans had ended the calculation mid-step. I stood there with my hands shaking and understood with total clarity that I had not made it out because I outran something. I made it out because something decided to stop. I pulled the footage that night. I watched it 3 times straight through and couldn't sleep. What I found in those early frames, Bigfoot already there, 10 feet behind me. Watching didn't shock me. What shocked me was the last frame. Sasquatch in the trees, eyes locked on me, arm reaching forward as if it could snatch me at any second. Watching it now, I can still feel that intent pressing in. And I know, if I'd hesitated for even a second, Bigfoot would have finished the job. That's the part that haunts me. Recordings of Bigfoot only show how elusive it is, but I captured him speaking extraordinary words. The Sasquatch looked me dead in the eyes as my GoPro recorded the exact moment it spoke to me in broken English, and what it said has left me shook until this day. I had been documenting everything from the moment we first heard the wood knocks echoing through the valley 3 days prior, my voice steady and professional as I described the patterns and intervals. But now, my words came out in fractured gasps as I tried to maintain some semblance of scientific observation while my body screamed at me to just run faster and forget about recording anything at all. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, I caught my first clear glimpse of the shape that had been pursuing us for the last quarter mile through increasingly difficult terrain. It was massive and upright, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, even at this distance, and the way it moved between the trees was deliberate and controlled, rather than the crashing panic I would have expected from any known animal, its long arms swinging in a rhythm that spoke of intelligence and intent rather than mindless aggression. It really is Bigfoot. Torin was still shouting, but his voice had taken on a different quality now, less panic and more something that sounded like anger or frustration, and I realized with a sick twist in my gut that he was yelling about getting better footage and not wasting this opportunity, while I was focused entirely on maintaining enough distance to avoid being caught by something that was clearly toying with us rather than actually trying to close the gap. Would Torin's obsession with footage jeopardize both our safety and my chance to document the creature responsibly? The ground began to slope downward more steeply, and I could hear water somewhere ahead, the white noise of it building into what had to be a substantial waterfall or rapids, and my boots were sliding in the duff and mud as I half ran and half controlled my fall down the incline. Behind me, the impacts had changed rhythm slightly, and I knew without looking that whatever was following us had also adjusted its pace to match the terrain, demonstrating a level of situational awareness that sent chills racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold sweat soaking through my layers. I burst into a clearing that opened up so suddenly it was disorienting. The space may be 40 feet across and dominated by a waterfall that cascaded down a basalt cliff face in multiple tiers before pooling into a creek that vanished back into the forest downstream. The clearing was carpeted in moss that glowed an almost luminescent green in the shafts of sunlight that actually penetrated here, and scattered boulders that had calved off from the cliff face over the centuries provided the only breaks in the otherwise smooth expanse. I spun around with the GoPro raised and my breath coming in harsh sobs that I was trying to quiet so I could listen. And for several heartbeats, there was nothing but the sound of the water and Torin crashing through the undergrowth somewhere to my left, still shouting about angles and documentation. Then the bushes at the clearing's edge simply parted, and it stepped through into the open space with a deliberateness that froze me in place more effectively than any amount of speed or aggression could have done. The Sasquatch was at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark auburn hair that was longer and more varied in texture than I had expected from the grainy footage and blurry photographs that I had studied for years before this expedition, with areas of lighter coloring around what I could only describe as its face, even though calling it a face felt both accurate and completely inadequate. The body proportions were wrong for any great ape I had ever seen, the torso barrel-shaped, and the arms long enough that the hands hung past where the knees would be on a human, and those hands were massive with fingers that looked capable of crushing bone without any particular effort. Could these proportions hint at evolutionary differences I had never considered? But at Bigfoot's eyes that stopped my breath entirely, because they were not the blank animal stare I had half expected, but instead held something that I could only describe as awareness and assessment, and what might have been curiosity. It stopped perhaps 20 feet from where I stood with the GoPro still raised, and its head tilted slightly to one side as it regarded me with an expression that I found myself reading as thoughtful, despite knowing that I was probably projecting human attributes onto something that was decidedly not human. My voice came out barely above a whisper, but I was still narrating into the camera out of pure habit, describing the muscle structure visible beneath the hair, and the way it was breathing slowly and deliberately rather than showing any signs of exertion from the chase. Torin finally burst into the clearing behind me, still yelling something about positioning and making sure I got everything in frame, but the creature's eyes never left me, and it made no acknowledgement of his presence at all, which seemed significant in a way I could not quite articulate. I lowered the GoPro slightly and held up my other hand palm out in what I hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression, and I found myself speaking directly to it rather than to the camera for the first time since we had started running. I told it that we were not there to hurt it, that we wanted to understand, that I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove that something like it existed, and that this moment meant more to me than I could possibly explain, but that I would leave right now if that was what it wanted. The silence that followed felt impossibly heavy and stretched out for what was probably only seconds, but felt like entire minutes. And then it made a sound that was definitely not an animal vocalization because it had structure and intentional modulation. The voice was deep and resonant in a way that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears, and the words came out slowly and carefully spaced, as though it was considering each one before committing to it aloud. It told me to stay and to watch and to not run, and each word was distinct and understandable, even though the pronunciation was slightly off in ways that suggested a vocal apparatus not quite designed for human speech. I felt my legs go weak and had to lock my knees to stay upright as the full implication crashed over me. Because this was not some clever animal mimicking sounds it had heard, this was deliberate communication with comprehension of meaning and context. Could I document this without losing control of my own fear? Torin had stopped shouting, and I could hear his breathing harsh and quick somewhere behind me, and I knew without looking that his face would have that expression it got when he was calculating value and potential rather than actually processing the profound nature of what was happening. The creature's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment, and something in its expression shifted in a way that made my stomach clench with an anxiety I could not quite name. But then its attention returned to me, and it repeated its instruction to stay and watch with a patience that felt almost deliberate. I slowly raised the GoPro again and asked it if this was okay, using the camera to gesture toward it in a way that I hoped made my question clear. And after a pause, it made a sound that might have been affirmative before turning its attention toward the waterfall and the creek. It moved to one of the larger boulders and settled into a crouch that somehow managed to look both alert and relaxed, and I realized it was demonstrating that it intended to remain here and that it expected us to do the same. My scientific training was warring with complete overwhelmed shock as I tried to maintain some kind of observational framework, and I began speaking softly into the camera again as I described everything I was seeing. I found myself asking questions aloud without really thinking about whether it would respond. Questions about who it was, and whether there were others, and how long it had been in this valley. The answers came slowly and with significant pauses between words, and I had the sense that it was translating concepts that might not have direct equivalents in English into something I could understand. It told me about family and home in words that were simple, but conveyed depths of meaning through tone and the slight changes in posture that accompanied them. And I realized I was witnessing something that would fundamentally alter everything we thought we understood about human evolution and the development of language. How could I process the implications of this knowledge without alerting Torin to my full understanding? Behind me, I could hear Torin moving around the clearing, trying to get different angles with his phone, and the creature tracked his movements with its eyes in a way that was distinctly wary, even as it continued to respond to my questions. I asked it how it had survived here without being discovered by the logging operations and hiking trails that crisscrossed these mountains. And its response involved words about watching and hiding and being quiet that came with a directness that suggested this was a learned survival skill rather than instinctive behavior. The sunlight filtering into the clearing was shifting as the afternoon progressed, and I had lost all sense of how long we had been standing there in this impossible conversation. But I was increasingly aware that the creature was assessing me as much as I was documenting it. Its questions came less frequently than mine, but they were pointed and specific, asking about why we had come here and what we wanted and whether we would bring others. And I found myself answering with an honesty that surprised me because lying to something this intelligent felt both impossible and morally wrong. I told it about my research and my years of following reports and alleged sightings, about the academic ridicule and the skepticism I had faced from colleagues who dismissed the entire field as pseudoscience and wishful thinking. I explained about Torin and his interest in documentation and funding, and how our goals for this expedition had not always aligned as clearly as they should have, and I watched something in the creature's expression shift when I mentioned Torin's name in a way that made the anxiety in my gut intensify into something closer to dread. What was it about Torin that had triggered this reaction, and how could that affect the encounter? It asked me about the camera and what I intended to do with what I was recording, and I knew that this was somehow a test or a threshold moment that would determine what happened next. I told it the truth, that the footage would prove its existence and change everything, but that I would respect its wishes if it wanted me to delete it, and the internal war between my life's work and the ethics of the situation was probably visible on my face because the creature made a sound that might have been understanding or sympathy. Its response was complex and involved multiple attempts to find the right words. But what I understood was that it knew about cameras and had seen humans with them before, that it understood the implications of being documented, and that it had made a conscious choice to allow this interaction to continue. This was not an accidental encounter or a creature that had been surprised by hikers and had no choice but to confront us. This was a deliberate decision made with full awareness of the consequences. And that realization made everything that had happened feel even more surreal and significant. Torin finally spoke up from where he had positioned himself near the edge of the clearing, his voice carrying a sharpness that made me wince because I could hear the greed and calculation in it, even if he thought he was being subtle. He was talking about getting closer for better details and about the value of clear facial footage, and I watched the creature's entire posture change from something that had been almost relaxed into something that was unmistakably threatening, even though it had not actually moved from its position on the boulder. I turned and told Torin to shut up and stay exactly where he was, with an urgency in my voice that must have gotten through because he actually stopped talking mid-sentence. And when I looked back at the creature, it was staring directly at him with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I found myself speaking quickly, trying to de-escalate whatever line had just been crossed, explaining that my partner sometimes did not think before he spoke, and that we would maintain whatever distance made it comfortable. Could I calm the situation before it escalated beyond negotiation? The creature's attention shifted back to me slowly, and I could see it thinking through the situation with a deliberation that was both fascinating and terrifying. And then it did something I had not expected at all by making a vocalization that was clearly not directed at me, but instead carried out into the forest beyond the clearing. The sound was structured and rhythmic with variations in pitch and tone that suggested something far more complex than a simple call. And I felt my heart rate spike as I realized it was summoning others and that we were about to have an entirely different kind of encounter than the one-on-one communication we had established. The response came from multiple directions at once, voices that were similar to the one that had been speaking with me, but distinct in their pitch and resonance, and I felt my legs begin to tremble as I realized we were about to be surrounded by something we had no framework for understanding. The creature on the boulder made another vocalization that was shorter and seemed to carry a different intent, and the answering calls adjusted their tone in a way that suggested acknowledgement or agreement, and I was struck by the complexity of what I was witnessing, even as pure instinctive terror tried to override my ability to observe and document. The first one to enter the clearing came from the northeast, parting the undergrowth with hands that looked even more massive than those of the one who had been speaking with me. And it was clear immediately that this individual was larger and more heavily built, with shoulders that had to be at least 4 feet across. The coloring was darker with patches of silver gray around what I could only think of as the face and chest, and when it moved into the open space, it did so with an authority that made every other living thing in the clearing feel suddenly very small and insignificant. Would this alpha-like presence decide we were a threat or something worth tolerating? 2 more appeared almost simultaneously from different points along the clearing's perimeter, these ones smaller, and what I guessed might be younger, based on the slightly less developed muscle structure and the way they positioned themselves in clear deference to the larger individual. Their hair was more uniformly brown, without the color variations I had noted in the first one, and they were silent as they took up positions that formed a loose semicircle around where Torin and I stood with our cameras still raised, because I was not about to stop documenting. Even if my hands were shaking so badly, the footage was probably going to be unusable. Another 3 emerged over the next several minutes, and I was frantically trying to note the differences between them while maintaining enough awareness to track their positions and movements, because I was suddenly very conscious of the fact that we were completely surrounded and that any route of escape had been effectively cut off by what was clearly a coordinated and intentional action. The sizes varied from perhaps 7 feet to well over 9, and the variations in coloring and build suggested different ages and possibly different roles within whatever social structure they maintained. The largest one, the silver-backed individual who had entered first, made a sound that was somehow both vocalization and something else, a deep thrumming that I felt resonate in my chest cavity and made my teeth ache with the subsonic components. The others responded with sounds that were clearly deferential, lower in volume and shorter in duration, and I watched as the one who had been speaking with me earlier rose from its position on the boulder and approached the larger individual with its head slightly lowered and its hands held away from its body in a gesture that was unmistakably submissive. Would the Alpha accept us as non-threats, or was this assessment only the beginning of judgment? What followed was an exchange that involved vocalizations I could not parse, along with physical gestures and postures that spoke of a social hierarchy as complex as anything I had observed in great apes or social primates, and I found myself narrating into the GoPro in a whisper that was probably too quiet to pick up clearly, but I could not risk speaking any louder. The silver-backed one turned its attention to me after this exchange, and I felt the full weight of its assessment in a way that was fundamentally different from the first creature's curiosity, because this was evaluation and judgment, and the decision about whether we represented a threat or something that could be tolerated. I did the only thing I could think of, and repeated what I had said to the first one, speaking slowly and clearly about our intentions and our desire to understand rather than harm. And I made sure to keep my body language as non-threatening as possible while maintaining eye contact, because I had the sense that looking away would be interpreted as deception or weakness. The silver-backed one tilted its head in a gesture that mirrored what the first creature had done, and then it spoke with a voice that was somehow even deeper and more resonant than I had expected. It asked me about fear and about truth, and about what I intended to do with the images I was capturing. And each question came with a weight that suggested it already knew the answers and was testing whether I would be honest or attempt to deceive. I told it that yes, I was afraid, but that fear did not mean I wanted to cause harm, that I had spoken truthfully about my research and my intentions, and that what I did with the footage would depend on what it and the others wanted, because I was beginning to understand that this was their territory and their choice, and that I was here only because they were allowing it. Could I convince them that our presence was not a violation, but a chance for understanding? The response came after a long pause during which I was aware of all the others watching and listening, and what it told me fundamentally changed my understanding of what these beings were and what this encounter meant. It spoke about watching humans for generations, about understanding our languages and our behaviors and our capacity for both destruction and occasionally something that might be respect or cooperation. And it made clear that this conversation was happening because they had collectively decided that perhaps the time had come for humans to know they existed and to understand that this knowledge came with responsibilities and boundaries. I felt tears starting to track down my face, and I did not bother to wipe them away because I was holding the GoPro with one hand and I did not want to make any sudden movements. And I asked it why now, and why us, and what it expected us to do with this impossible gift of knowledge. The answer involved multiple individuals contributing words and sounds, a conversation that was clearly happening between them as much as it was being directed at me. And I understood that this was not a decision that had been made lightly or quickly, but rather something they had been considering and debating among themselves. What I learned in the next hour as the afternoon light continued to shift and change was more than I could have imagined possible. because they were willing to answer questions and demonstrate behaviors and allow me to observe interactions that revealed depths of culture and social complexity that made my academic training feel inadequate and reductive. They showed me how they communicated through combinations of vocalization and gesture, and something that might have been percussion using specific rhythms beaten out on their chests or on nearby logs. And I watched hierarchical interactions that involved what I could only describe as negotiation and consensus building rather than simple dominance displays. The younger ones were more curious and approached closer despite clear signals from the adults to maintain distance, and I noted the way the older individuals would redirect them with gentle physical contact and low vocalizations that seemed to serve an educational or corrective function. One of the smaller ones reached out toward my GoPro with obvious fascination, and I held very still as massive fingers that could have crushed the camera without effort instead traced its outline with unexpected delicacy, and the creature made a questioning sound that I interpreted as asking how it worked. I found myself explaining in simple terms about lenses and recording and how the device captured images and sounds, and I was aware that I was probably anthropomorphizing, but the attention and interest seemed genuinely focused on understanding rather than simple curiosity. The adult nearest to us, one of the medium-sized individuals with reddish-brown coloring, made a sound that caused the younger one to withdraw its hand, and then it spoke to me about teaching and learning and about how the young ones needed to understand both humans and the dangers they represented. Was this exchange my chance to build trust, or was one wrong word enough to break it? Torin had been uncharacteristically silent for most of this extended interaction, but I could hear him moving around the perimeter of the space we had been implicitly confined to, and I was increasingly worried about what he might do because I knew his patience for observation without action was limited. The creatures were clearly tracking his movements as well, and I noticed that whenever he shifted position, at least two of them would adjust their own positions to maintain what was probably a tactical advantage, and the level of coordinated awareness suggested communication methods I was not detecting. I asked the silver-backed leader about their social structure and their territory, and how they had remained hidden for so long, despite increasing human presence in these mountains. And the answers came from multiple individuals contributing pieces of information that built into a comprehensive picture. They described a network of family groups that maintained loose contact across vast territories, methods of communication that involved structured vocalizations that could carry for miles through the forest, and an acute awareness of human patterns and behaviors that allowed them to avoid contact when they chose to do so. The concept that they chose to remain hidden rather than being simply elusive due to low population numbers was significant, and I asked directly whether there had been times when they could have revealed themselves but had decided against it. The response involved what I interpreted as something close to humor, a sound that was almost like laughter, and the leader told me about humans who had come so close to seeing them that they could have reached out and touched them, but who had been looking at their phones or talking loudly to each other and had missed what was standing just off the trail, watching them pass. Could human obliviousness explain why they had survived so long, or was it more than chance? I wanted to know about their ethics and their understanding of right and wrong, whether they had concepts that paralleled human morality, or whether their social rules operated on entirely different principles, and this question seemed to interest them because multiple individuals contributed to the answer in what became almost a philosophical discussion. They spoke about balance and about respecting the boundaries of other beings, about taking only what was needed, and about the consequences that came to those who violated the agreements that held their society together. It was during this discussion that the tone shifted noticeably, because the leader made a direct reference to watching and judging and understanding the difference between those who came to the forest with respect and those who came with greed or the intention to exploit what they found. Its eyes moved deliberately to where Torin was standing at the clearing's edge, and the statement it made next was unambiguous in its implication that not all humans present were considered equally trustworthy or safe. I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what it meant, And I knew that Torren's barely concealed calculation and his comments about footage value and funding opportunities had not gone unnoticed. And I tried to explain that humans varied greatly in their intentions and their respect for boundaries, just as I assumed they did in their own communities. The leader acknowledged this with a gesture that suggested agreement, but made it clear that acknowledgement of variation did not mean tolerance for those who demonstrated harmful intent. And I felt the weight of that statement settle over the clearing like a physical presence. Could I prevent a tragic outcome if Torren ignored their warning? Torren chose that moment to speak up for the first time in nearly an hour, his voice carrying an edge of frustration as he said something about needing better close-up footage and about how we should be documenting this more thoroughly for maximum impact, and every single creature in the clearing went completely still in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I found myself speaking quickly to try to redirect attention away from what had just been said, explaining that different humans had different priorities, and that not everyone understood the ethics of this situation the way I was beginning to. The leader made a sound that was clearly directed at Torren rather than at me, and the words that came out were simple but carried unmistakable meaning about boundaries and respect and the consequences of ignoring warnings. Torren responded with something dismissive about not being threatened by animals, no matter how well they could mimic human speech, and I felt everything in my chest go cold and tight because I knew he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. What happened next unfolded with a terrible deliberateness, a structured act rooted in their culture. The largest creature stood before Torren while two others gripped his shoulders and arms, preventing him from pulling away. The silver-backed leader began ritual vocalizations, joined by the others in harmonics that made my bones vibrate and tears blur my vision. I realized I was witnessing a ceremony that doubled as execution. Torren screamed, his face contorted with terror and disbelief, but the chorus absorbed his cries. The leader pressed on his chest, the pattern of vocalization shifting into something mournful, yet certain. I could not look away, bearing witness the only way to honor him. His ribs began to compress under the inexorable force, and his screams morphed into something animal. When his ribs finally cracked, the sickening sound carried over the chanting. The leader twisted Torren's neck with a single motion, silencing him. The ritual concluded. The creatures lowered his body gently, then stepped back, forming a perimeter around the clearing. Would their judgment extend to me, or had I proven myself safe? I had recorded everything on the GoPro, from the ritual's beginning to Torren's final breath. The leader acknowledged the camera, then spoke calmly about choice, consequence, and the enforcement of boundaries. Torren's death was not murder, but the result of his refusal to respect their rules. I told it I understood and would honor their trust. I walked into the forest, the creature's vocalizations fading behind me. The hike back took all night, navigating difficult terrain while processing trauma and grief. I also knew I had been given something rare, a bridge between human understanding and an intelligence that had chosen to reveal itself. And I would carry that truth forward, fully and clearly.